Well, why don't we all get a Bible out and let's go to the Old Testament, back to the book of 2 Samuel, and we are in 2 Samuel chapter 4. 2 Samuel chapter 4. You were thinking chapter 5 because that's what the handout said, but I forgot we didn't get finished with chapter 4, so I'm going to throw it in and we're going to kind of rush through chapter 4 and pick up chapter 5 tonight. So we'll get started here in just a second. Before we begin, though, Lamar, can I ask you, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Let's pray. We got our Father in heaven, where you can be this time. Thankful, Father, for the day that you give us, but especially for this time that we have to come together in the middle of our week, to set aside our worldly concerns and to study from your word. That you be with us as we enter into the study. Help us as we look back at the Old Testament and the stories that are recorded there, so we can learn from them and apply them to our lives today. We ask, Father, that you be with those that are not with us, bring them back so they can worship with us once again. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Lord. So, starting off, we've got right now our two kingdoms. And you remember last week we talked about how there was the kingdom that's Israel. It's really not. I'm going to be careful to say the geographical concept here isn't really clear. But we got David is king in Judah, and who's king in Israel? Who's the king that? We really don't even count him as king, but somebody's got to say it. Ishbosheth, yes. If I'd have had another son, that was definitely the name I would have gone. Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth's general, Abner, was murdered last week. He was murdered by Judah's general, Joab, after he had switched sides and he was going to bring everybody over. He's murdered. That's bad. I really wish we could talk some more about Joab. We're going to get some time to talk about Joab because he's going to pop up a lot. He's an interesting guy. I mean, interesting in a good way. But he is very interesting when you talk about him. First thing chapter 4 tells us is that Saul's son, that's Ishbosheth, heard that Abner had died in Hebron. It says he lost heart. He lost heart. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about there for a moment, and what's going on here. And I kind of wonder, why did Ishbosheth lose heart? Why is it that he hears about? You might think, my general just changed sides and he got murdered, and maybe that will stop other people from changing sides. But instead, he's thinking, no, they killed Abner? Why? What do you think it bothered him?
Abner led an army, so he had a lot of strength and power from being the leader of the army. But he also was one that put Ishbosheth in power.
Yeah.
Without him there, Ishbosheth was at risk of being dethroned or removed from power.
I think we're going to get the impression from this chapter, nobody was really there for Ishbosheth. They were all there for Abner. And I think that Ishbosheth knew it. And you're exactly right, Lamar. The idea is that Ishbosheth, was kind of led by Abner. He just really wasn't, in Ishbosheth's defense, he probably never expected he was going to be king. He has three other brothers ahead of him. And, what's the chances? And suddenly he's the king. So the point is that without Abner, he really doesn't have much hope. So he's really worried about these things. Now, what we get this little story in verses 4 and 5, verse 4 about another person with a tough name, Mephibosheth. We'll come back to him in chapter 9. But a couple of men of Benjamin in verse 5, we read about these sons of Benjamin, decide they're going to go visit Ishbosheth. And what they do is that they go down to visit him. Kind of interesting that they just go right up to the king's house. It's not like it's a palace. Gives you a sense that he's not much of a king, if we can even call him a king. They go in his house, and what do? They kill him. Yeah, they murder him. They behead him, and they run off all the way down to David at Hebron. They come down to David at Hebron, and they say, here, they knock on David's door. They say, David, here you go. Here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my Lord, the king, this day of Saul and his descendants. Now, want to think about this for a second. Here they brought in Ishbosheth's head. And of course, what are they expecting? Yeah. Boy, read the room, guys. You really weren't thinking this through, because the last time a guy showed up, an Amalekite showed up, it didn't go well for him. Now that time, the Amalekite helped Saul kill himself, and David, of course, executed him. This time, they just murdered him. Now, what's interesting, of course, is, David didn't quite have that same love and affection for Ishbosheth that he had for Saul. But what I think is really interesting is that he says, look, last time guys showed up saying, look, Saul was dead, thinking they brought me good news. I arrested him. I had him executed. Because he thought he was going to get a reward for that. Now, verse 11, how much more when wicked men have killed a righteous person in his own bed? Therefore, shall I not require his blood at your hand or remove you from the earth? So David commanded his young men, and they executed him. But they didn't just execute him. If you read, they cut off their hands and their feet and hung them up by the pool in Hebron. So David makes quite a scene by this. There's something that really struck me here as shocking. That David says, what about when you kill a righteous person? Now, first of all, I kind of wonder about what that's inferring about Saul. And I think maybe it is kind of inferring Saul wasn't a righteous man. And so he says, how much more when wicked men kill a righteous man? Well, was Ishbosheth a righteous man? What do you think? Was Ishbosheth righteous? No. That's the first thing I thought of. Well, I actually don't think of any. I can't think of anything Ishbosheth did that was evil. Not like Saul. You can point to that. So maybe he was. Maybe David isn't just being speaking with hyperbole or something like that. Maybe Ishbosheth really wasn't that bad of a guy. We don't know one way or the other. Really, we don't have much of a picture of him. But we certainly don't see him having done the things that King Saul did. So I'm prepared to take David at his word. Ishbosheth is dead. And Ishbosheth, of course, is the last thing. That's the obstacle from David being king, right? So that brings us now to chapter 5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, indeed, we're your bone, we're your flesh. Now this is interesting, verse 2. In times past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in, and the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel. Therefore, all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. And now David is king. Last obstacle's in his way and has been done away with. What kind of things does David have to deal with, though, right now? David just got made king, and maybe it's not the best time to be king. Because what's your big problem right now? You got a couple of them. He's going to try to solve one of them in the next chapter. So that problem is the worship of Israel is broken, right? They don't have a place to worship. They're kind of all scattered everywhere. What's not in the middle of the worship? What's missing? The ark. That's pretty bad. Just think about this. That means that the high priest, and by the way, who is the high priest? We'll talk about him in a little while, but the high priest really isn't, kind of young for the high priest, because all the other priests are dead. The high priest hasn't been going in and waving over the ark and doing the Day of Atonement, and that's really bad. Your worship is broken during this time. What else is a problem? What's your national problem? Of course, you just finished a civil war. That's bad, but what else? They're not united. Yeah. Now, they seem to be kind of trying to fix that right now, but they're not united. Stan throws out here, well, they got an enemy. The Philistines. Remember, the Philistines just came in and took a lot of their cities and took a lot of their things. And in fact, in Chronicles, it said that the Philistines are all the way to Bethlehem, to David's hometown. That's right in the middle of things. That's right. There has been a huge loss of the army. So when a country fights a civil war, that means the guy that's the third party is really going to win well, because he's got everybody broken. So this is not maybe the best time to be king. And David does something really interesting now. David decides at verse 6, the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, inhabitants of the land. And they're going to overcome. Kind of a neat story. Of course, if you remember, he says, you'll not come in here. The blind and the lame will throw you out. What kind of city was Jerusalem? It's sitting on a hill. I should have brought a picture. That would have been nice. So imagine Jerusalem. There's kind of these two valleys that go up. I'll turn my back so you see it. There's these two valleys that go up. Jerusalem sits on the hill right in the middle. And imagine these walls all around it. So that if you're the guys attacking, you got to attack uphill to get to a walled city. In fact, it's called a stronghold, as it's described in verse 7, the stronghold of Zion. The stronghold of Zion. It's a pretty fortified city. So they say, yeah, anybody will be able to knock you out. But David has a plan. How does David get access to the city? Well, he does inquire of God. That's right. Very good. He does inquire of God. In verse 8, he says, whoever climbs, and by the way, if we read the Chronicle account, we'd get a better sense of that. He says, now, whoever climbs up by the way of the water shaft and defeats the Jebusites, the implication is he shall be a chief and a captain. It's stated in First Chronicles that whoever that's going to be is going to be it. Now, here's kind of a tricky question. Anybody, if you read First Chronicles, do you know who the guy that went up there and did it was? Who's that guy Brian said is really kind of an interesting guy? It was Joab. Yeah, it was Joab. That was the guy that went in there. Some people think maybe this is the area that later on Hezekiah would tunnel out, and that this enormous tunnel, it's still there today. Could be. Whatever it is, though, this area David takes now becomes the city of David. Now, my question is, why did he do this? Didn't throw this out there as a question. I don't know the answer for sure, but why did he do this? Why did he go and say, that's going to be my city. That's going to be the city of David. Why did he do it? I mean, it's kind of like, David, you could have picked a city that we already own. Instead, you picked a Jebusite city. So why did he do this? What do you think, Anthony? Was that just you were scratching your chin and not raising your hand kind of? Well, let's think of a couple of reasons. Let's think of a spiritual half and maybe a practical half. But Stephen, go ahead. What were you going to suggest?
I'm not sure if I understood the question, but I'm not sure if this is the right answer at all. But wouldn't this, the Jebusites, that was Jerusalem, that would be Mount Moriah.
I didn't hear you.
Mount Moriah.
It would be Mount Moriah. That's correct.
So that would be the place where they worship God.
Yeah, it will be the place where they ultimately worship God. That we're going somewhere with that idea. Yeah. Oh, well, like a war against the third party might unify the country. Well, it is kind of smart that's one of the first things we do is to go after one of the Canaanite tribes that we were supposed to have eradicated. That's good. Well, one thing might be, Anthony, you ready?
Yeah, I'm thinking, is that since Jerusalem is on a hill, so it would be harder to actually defeat it.
Yeah, so one of the things about Jerusalem is it sits in a great position for being defended. Again, those slopes up the hill, and Gregor catches that online. Gregor says it was defensible. What really was, and really this fortress that is Jerusalem was very much defensible. But perhaps the second reason is there is a holy context to this city already. What's the holy context of the past? Stephen?
Well, Melchizedek was from.
Melchizedek was from here. By the way, David's going to be talking about Melchizedek in a couple of years. And that's interesting. So, number one, you got Melchizedek. Number two, what else?
Well, we also just thinking that the reason Mount Moriah is because that's where Abraham said.
Yes. So this is also the place where Abraham would bring Isaac for a sacrifice. So this is a special place already. There's just a lot to think about with this city, that there was already something to it. But one of the things that we're probably not going to get stated outright, but it's going to become real important here in chapter 7, is that God had prophesied there was going to be a place where he was going to set his name. And this is going to be it. Give it away a spoiler here. This is where he's going to put his name. What do you got?
I remember something about him paying for a threshing floor.
Yes, you do. Now, we're not there yet, though, because that's going to be later on in 2 Samuel. That we're going to be talking about the threshing floor and something happening there. And that threshing floor sits at the top of the hill, and City of David is just down from it. So that is going to be something really important. So that's going to be something really important. Got a question for you here as we think about this. David goes on then, by the way, and it says in verse 17 that the Philistines heard David had been anointed king. Now, how do you think Philistines felt about that? They didn't say, that's our boy, that's one of our guys, because he had been one of their guys. When they hear about it, what do? Well, we say it. Yeah, so when they hear it, they all go searching for David, not to congratulate. David heard of it. He goes down to the stronghold. Kind of interesting, it talks about him going down to the stronghold. I told you that the stronghold wasn't at the very top. The Philistines went down and deployed themselves in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquires of the Lord, shall I go? Well, I love David to always ask. Isn't that really neat that David always asks? The Lord says, yeah, go do it. So David goes out there and defeats them. He says, the Lord has broken my enemies before me like a breakthrough of water. The Philistines, verse 22, try again. Second part of this one. And they go out again, and David asks again, shall I go? This time God even tells him, here's the plan. Gives him the plan. Verse 25, David does so, and he drives the Philistines all the way back from Geba as far as Gazer. So, in fact, he just sends them entirely out of Israel. So remember, the big problems David has, we got number 1, worship's broken. Number 2, the Philistines are on top of us, and he's just beat the Philistines. He's just broke them off, and they've all scattered and gone back home. And so all he's got left is to fix this other problem. Got a couple of questions for you to think about. First of all, let's ask this. Why is it that the people are finally submitting to David? Why is it that all this time they're finally getting the idea? They even said, we know that God made you the king, but they're only now doing it. I guess the easy answer is, yeah, what's that? Oh, that's interesting. That's good. I'll come back to that here in a second. Yeah. Well, everybody's dead that they've had, right? So I think it's part of it. I like that idea of being scared of Saul, especially if Abner is kind of the driving force there. Maybe that's a great reason why they're doing these things. With Abner gone, with Ishbosheth gone, maybe that really is exactly what it's all about.
Saul spent a lot of his time chasing after David. David spending his time getting rid of his enemies.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of interesting that they said, we know that you're the guy that's going to take care of Israel. And the first thing he does is take care of Israel. That's really neat. First thing he does is kind of finish one of the last places of the conquest that Joshua started. So there's kind of a neat connection there. So you're right. That really is a neat point. He's finishing things, or he's putting things in order that hadn't been taken care of. And like I said, that this is the worship, this is the Philistines. He's bringing it all together. He's bringing it all together. So second question was, how old was David when he became king in Judah? 30 years old. Kind of a neat statement. How old was Jesus when he started preaching? 30 years old. 30 years old. So David is 30 years old. How long will he rule as king total? 40 years. So we'll see him dying at 70. So just some important details that we get in there. How long was he just king in Judah? Just in Judah. So yeah, 7.5. Then how long for all of Israel? Yeah, that's the 33. So yeah, so it breaks up nicely there. So this is David's kingship. Now, next question is, I got to get the right computer here. What are some of the other names that Jerusalem had? The old names or the common names it had? What do you got, Teresa? Salem. So when we first go to Jerusalem, the very first time, and that Stephen mentioned Melchizedek, at that time it's called the city of Salem. The city of Salem. Salem means peace, shalom, peace, yeah. What else is it called?
Zion.
Zion. We saw that name here too. And a lot of times when it's called Zion, they say that's the fortress part in particular. I don't know. Zion is actually a weird etymology. I don't know. Tried to study the word once, and it wasn't entirely clear what all that word meant. So that's kind of interesting. So Zion, and then he calls it what? The city of David. Yeah, then it becomes the city of David. What else is it called, Ryan? The city of Jebus. Why? Because the Jebusites lived there. So interestingly enough, they were called Jebus for a while as well. So that's the other one too. Now there's a whole bunch of symbolic names as well. So many, can't even list them all. I always like Ariel, the Lion of God, or different names like that. Sometimes some bad names, like it's called Sodom, in the New Testament too. So there's that as well. So you get a lot of different names for Jerusalem in the Bible. But the idea is, the big names you want to know is, you want to know those names Salem, so you can tie it back to King Melchizedek, Stephen mentioned. You want to know that it's also the city of Jebus, and that's some people say that's where Jerusalem comes from, but Jeru also means to flow. So, the peace of God that flows, the city of David, the city of Zion. We want to know all these names. They're really special. They're really special names. And sometimes, like when we're singing songs, we sing songs like Zion or On Zion's Glorious Summit. These are names for what? The New Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, Zion. What are we singing about? Yeah, we're not singing about a city on the other side of the world. We're actually singing about the church, because the church is the spiritual, the heavenly Jerusalem. So very good. They kind of said something interesting I've kind of wondered about here. There was the statement about whenever David was going to seize it, and they say, oh, David, well, the blind and the lame are going to be able to repel. And so David takes over. And there's this statement in verse 8 where it puts in parentheses. And by the way, the parentheses are there because they're not exactly sure how it fits into the context of the statement. The lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul. And then it goes on to say, the blind and the lame shall not come in the house of David. How do you take that passage? I'm just curious what you think. That's a puzzler for me. Because my first question is, did David really hate the blind and the lame and they never come in his house? No, because a couple of chapters, we're going to have a very important story about a man who was lame and is effectively adopted by David as a son to sit at his table. So that doesn't quite make sense. But what do you think? Anybody have a good thought on this? I wanted to hear a good answer. George?
Just what they were saying.
It sounds like, for one thing, they're just saying that it might have been I was kind of wondering if maybe it's the idea like David hates the Jebusites, or he's going to destroy the Jebusites, and they're all from his consideration blind and lame, because, that's it.
I think the Jebusites feel like they were so safe that
Yeah.
Nobody can take it.
Yeah, and so, David, when he takes them, it might be an insult back on them too. That's good. What else? Anybody else? Well, like I said, it's kind of a puzzle to me. Stan throws out there that he wonders if it's the Jebusites that are saying this and not David. When it says in verse 8, they say this. So I don't know, it could be the case too. It's a puzzler, but it doesn't seem, like I said, to play out well as something that's accurate, as much as either it's a play on words meant to be an insult against the Jebusites. I think all of those are good answers to consider what this might mean. Now, one of the things we would have read about here is that when he establishes this place, David went on and became great with the Lord. And verse 11 says that Hiram, the king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees and carpenters, and they built David a house. What? Why did the king of Phoenicia, and the Phoenicians they're kind of Canaanites, but they're not among the ones they were supposed to dispossess. Why did a king of Phoenicia say, I'm going to build David a house? What do you think about that?
I was wondering if maybe it wasn't politically expedient.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking too. I think that's a great answer, Stephen. It might have just been a politics play. Because the verse right before it says David was becoming great. He just beat the Philistines, which had to have been a problem for the Phoenicians. So that makes sense too. What else do you got? Anybody else? So, go ahead.
Well, they've been fighting for a long time, so they may not have craftsmen to go that they may have had otherwise.
One of the things that the ancient world talks about is that the Phoenicians were the best of the craftsmen. The Phoenicians up in Lebanon, what's the famous resource of Lebanon? Yeah, the cedars of Lebanon, and they've got the stonemasons, and they've got the the great lumber for these things. So they have a lot of resources. They have the craftsmen, the tools to do this. What are the Phoenicians going to do for them a little later on? Yeah, they're going to build the temple. Very interesting, by the way. When you look at each temple and who built it, it's always interesting to see how it was Gentiles that set it up. It was the Phoenicians, it was the Persians, it was the Romans. I find that kind of interesting. So anyway, the whole thing here, though, is that David, the idea is that there's a sense of what it is that is going on here. Maybe real politics. Maybe Hiram just knows that David is the guy. It just might be a recognition of the power of David. Anybody else? So Stan has a statement. He says, well, and I think he's saying the nearness of the countries. So the close proximity of the countries. He points out they had a similar language, and that the people of Phoenicia depended on the Israelites for a lot of their things. So, again, it might have been a realpolitik kind of decision as well. It's kind of interesting that the Philistines then are trying to seek out David. And I was wondering about this. How do they know? Oh, I'm sorry. How does David know that God was with him? Sorry, I'm reading the wrong question. How does David know God's with him at this point? So how so? What kind of things? Yeah, well, so here's what's kind of interesting. He still hasn't defeated the Phoenicians when this statement comes, or I'm sorry, the Philistines. He still hasn't defeated the Philistines when this comes up, but he has just taken the city of Jerusalem. And I kind of get a sense that maybe underneath some of this, and remember, there's a prophecy about God putting his name somewhere. We know a little later on it's going to be Jerusalem. That there's a sense here that maybe God has promoted him to take or pushed him into taking this place. David realized, things have been happening. I mean, what just made him king? Somebody murdered Ishbosheth. What made him, what made Ishbosheth king? Well, somebody took the life of Saul. That all these things have fallen into place. I want to say, and David has passed all the tests. God has been testing him for years. We talked about this back at the cave of El Gadai, that God has been putting him to test after test after test. And I get a sense here that with the city of the Jebusites being the last of these things, here's the last test. David passes it. And boy, if we could just end the life of David after like chapter 9, chapter 10, it would be a great story, because after that, we're going to see some of David's great blunders. But up until that time, he has done everything. He's passed every test that God has given him. And now God has brought him the great reward that he promised him all along. So that really is a great, powerful idea of what it is that, how does he know? Now, I had a question about the Philistines here. The Philistines, why would they seek David out? Already mentioned a little bit. Why is it, though, they hear about David king? And like I said, I kind of wondered why. Well, why don't they think, hey, it's one of our guys on the throne? Why are they extra angry, it seems like, with David? What do you think?
I was kind of thinking that, since they had civil war and they see this new figure who's risen from a great warrior to a king, that this might be the only opportunity, the last opportunity they have to take him out.
Yeah, that's good.
It's just a budding down kingdom, and they see it that way. To kill it early would be the best bet.
This is an opportune time for one thing. So you're exactly right on that. They would be at their weakest at this moment, so that makes sense. Ryan, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I wonder if David was only actually friends with just that little sliver of the guy.
I was going to say there are 5 lords of the Philistines, and David was actually only friends with one of them. And how good a friend was he? They said, we don't trust David, send him home. So David really wasn't one of the Philistines' guys, and I think the Philistines understood that to that end. Anything else? When they heard Ishbosheth was king, they didn't go after him. Why David? What kind of guy is David?
What part of the thought is David, they see him as consolidating parts that had been at war with each other. So that consolidation is going to have a better army, have a more unified front versus what they've been doing.
You know, it might have been the case, and Lamar, kind of thinking of what you said there, that if they knew that if they went after Ishbosheth, they'd be not helping themselves because they'd be helping David. So they left things alone to see how it play out. So that's yeah. Last thing might be this: David's dangerous. If there's one thing the Philistines would know about David is a killer. He's dangerous. He is a soldier. And he's not the guy you'd want to face. So going a little bit back to what several of you said, this is probably the best time to deal with these problems. In all honesty, it's a smart move. You know, don't wait for him to attack us. Let's take care of him. He's just finished fighting a battle. Let's go attack him. And of course, that's when they're going to lose. Let's go ahead. We'll pass over this question for the sake of time so we can get into chapter 6. Let's go ahead and go over to chapter 6 now. So number one problem is that the Philistines are on top of the nation, and that's done. But the second problem is the worship of Israel is broken. We don't even have priests at this point. Can you imagine much more broken than that? We do have priests, but not many. The massacre at Nob took care of a lot of that. The conversation about a tabernacle we'll come back to in chapter 9, but whatever tabernacle there is doesn't seem to be the same one that we met back in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel. We don't have the ark. But David recognizes that if we can bring these things back together, that matters. I don't know why, Saul, for all of his, why won't God talk to me? Never bothers to try to do this, to bring these things back together. So David decides to do this kind of a neat way. It's brought up here in verse 2 when it says they're going to go to bring up the ark of God, whose name is called by the name, the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. This is kind of a really neat point. By the way, pay attention when you see something like that, because that's a real important play on who is God. It's the name. It's the Lord of hosts. All of that's impressive stuff. Now we know that it's being brought out from the house of Abinadab. His sons, we talked about this way back in 1 Samuel, that were the guys that were kind of working there, ministering there, are going out with it. David, verse 5, is with them and all the house of Israel, and they're playing music. And really, what would you describe this as? A big, think of it like this. The ark's being moved, and there's lots of music and things. What would we call it? Celebration. I was looking for the word parade. This is exciting. This big movement of people. This, and think about celebration. You just beat the Philistines. Our nation's coming back together. I mean, it's like VE Day. Back in World War II, everybody's celebrating the war was over. That's what this is. And as they're going along, will you tell me what happens? So it's a good cart, Tacho? Say it again. Yeah, we haven't got there yet, but we'll see David dancing, and his wife at the time is going to say, "You're making a fool of yourself." I want to come to that, Tacho. We'll come back to that. What else? What happens here?
They put the ark on a cart versus carrying.
Oh, no, tell us what the problem is yet. This is the preacher part that we want to get to about the lesson part. So they're moving it on a cart.
The oxen stumble, and Uzzah reaches out to it.
It, reaches out to stop the Ark of the Covenant from falling on the ground. Pretty noble thing to do. And for that noble act, God kills him. God kills him. Which is an immensely important story. Of course, everybody stops. It says David is angry. It says David is afraid. And they just leave the ark there, more or less. Well, not exactly. They move it into a house nearby, but they just said, we're done. We're leaving. And it's there for months before they say, okay, let's go back and listen to Monique and move it the way that might be more appropriate. I like the way in the book of Chronicles, it just makes a big point about David saying, we're only supposed to move it one way. And they'll bring it all the way back to Jerusalem after that. And that's where the second time as David is coming in, that Tacho's point about, he's dancing and he's doing these things and Michael sees him. What's the word that's used about what Michael was feeling when she saw him? I think you said it. Despised him. Despised him. I want to think about that here just a little bit. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So let's first of all talk about this. Well, why was it that David gathered the army to move the ark? Why did David gather the army? In fact, I want to kind of make a couple of points here. So do you tell me, why does David gather, it says, what did it say? I just forgot the amount of men. 30,000. Why does David gather his army to move the ark? Okay, that's a good point. He didn't want to lose it. They lost it in battle before, so that's great. What else? I think there's something of, like I said, again, a big military parade. You've won the battle. You bring all your men out. So I think there's that. Any other thoughts? It's just this, like I said, I think there's a lot of things to think about here. And I want to plug this idea for a second. What if, you're the king and you got this big army and you're thinking, how do I honor God? Well, I bring the whole army out. Let's think of it like that for a second too. Bring the whole army out. Now, the Bible is very specific to say that they didn't just put it in any old cart. What did they do? They put it in a brand new cart. What do you think the significance of that? And I'm going to tie it back to this, maybe even the significance of the army coming there. What do you think the significance is of it being a new cart? This is a preacher point kind of thing. Lamar, what do you got?
Oh, I can't say it. There's an intent that they built the car specifically for this purpose.
Yes, so that's it. So what kind of intent does that reveal? In other words, if they said, no, an old cart won't do, we need a brand new cart. Maybe I want to add some things if you're okay with this, Lamar. A glorious cart or a powerful cart or a beautiful cart. What's the point? Yes. Teresa, what were you going to say?
I was thinking maybe a new beginning.
New beginning. Yeah, that's actually, I really didn't think of that. That's a neat point. Tacho. Well, so it's interesting, you're a new person when you're baptized, right? So I can see a connection to that. Yeah. So here's the idea. David's thinking, you know what? I want to glorify God. What better glory can you give God than a military parade? All your soldiers out there. What better glory can you give than a brand new cart? And we're going to glorify God, and we're going to celebrate this, and everybody bring your music, and we're going to honor God. And God breaks out. Did you ever notice the name of the place there at verse 8? Perez Uzzah. The Lord broke out. What do you think broke out means? Yes. Go ahead.
Well, they were trying to glorify him, and all he wanted was a
Yes. Teresa got the preacher point. You can have a Brian point for that. There's no such thing as a preacher point. They're worthless. The point is, they were trying to glorify God their way. And God was angry enough that his wrath broke out against them. And so when I was wondering about this, let's skip this question. Why did Uzzah touch the ark? I think it's, he probably was trying to do it. When I say, why was David angry? And then it says, why was David afraid? Well, here it is. Like I said, David invested a lot. What do you think? What would you say here? Why was David angry?
He was angry at himself because he didn't follow the instructions that were given.
Nice.
So he actually caused death.
I think that's a really interesting observation, Lamar. I kind of lean towards the idea that, but of course, part of it is, God, I tried to do, something really nice for you, and you didn't appreciate it. Not only did you not appreciate it, you actually struck us down. You actually exploded in anger over it. So could even be he's angry with God. But yeah, to say, oh, look what I did. David was very conscientious, and a guy is now dead. And let's be clear, it does seem like people were looking at David about this one. So that's great. Ryan?
I wonder too, as it probably didn't just pass out, otherwise they wouldn't know God did it. So
Oh, that's
probably pretty dramatic. Like he might have been just like blasted out or hit by lightning. Or...
Very interesting, especially with the term outbreak, right? Very interesting, Ryan. It doesn't say how he died. I didn't even think about that. I just think of him dying, but maybe there was something dramatic about that death.
Well, David knew God's power, and he probably knew what was coming.
That would be the second answer, right? He's scared, because he did. And by the way, let's think of all the things David has done. He really hasn't, can I say, blown it before? So this really is David's big first mistake, Dee.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. He asked God almost every move that he made.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, what happens?
Doesn't ask God, right? Oh, Dee, that's a great point, by the way.
But then God went to the opposite extreme from what he was used to.
You know what? So, Dee, I would love to think about this for a moment. Why didn't David ask? When he had just, he just asked about the Philistines and everything else. Why doesn't he ask? And I think the answer is, oh, go ahead, Stephen.
I think that you made that point at the beginning of the study, that they didn't have any real idea.
Well, they don't, do they? But by the way, what's really interesting is the solution they're going to come up with is, well, first and foremost, they're going to pick the people. The question is going to be, who do they pick to then take care of the ark? So I think they knew something, but you're right. They're pretty ignorant. But here's the point. I think it's profound when you consider the idea that, they've done everything that they thought was great. And David is almost certainly thinking, well, I'm doing a good thing. God's got to be happy about this. Bringing back the ark and bringing his whole army. And, he's got the new cart. They got everything set up. I mean, God's got to be happy about this. So why does he break out? In fact, Stan's comment online is David said, I did my best. Why? And I think that's it. Why? When I just tried. And of course, what we know is he didn't do what God said. And this is the big lesson here. He didn't do what God said. He did what he thought was a great idea. The modern religion of the world today is just do what you think is right. If you do it with a sincere heart, there's no question. There was no more sincere heart. The Bible says that, right? No more heart after God than David. There was no more sincere heart than David. But it wasn't enough, because obedience is what God says. George?
You can't please God by disobeying his law.
Yeah, nice. You can't please God by disobeying his rule, his law, his will. Fantastic. So they all leave the ark. Of course, the ark of the Lord is then taken. Verse 10. David wouldn't move the ark to the city. Kind of wonder if it's kind of I'm scared to move it now. I don't want to do anything. So he took it aside. Like I said, it almost feels like they just left it there, to Obed-Edom the Gittite. Obed-Edom the Gittite. Who is this guy? He was a Levite. Although it talks about him as Gittite, there's a lot of people think Gittite, that's you don't know why I'm snapping, so I don't know why you're looking at me funny. Trying to think of Goliath was a Gittite, but it actually tells us later on that this guy was, in fact, a Levite. And in the Chronicles, it wants us to understand very clearly that all the men that took care of the ark from this point on are Levites. So at least somebody starts thinking, David or somebody else, hey, maybe what we need to do is to do this right. And of course, here it states that the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all of his house. So now the ark is being blessed, it says. Or I'm sorry, the house of Obed-Edom is being blessed. So David decides, well, then I'm going to bring it back. This time, of course, how did they move it? In 1 Chronicles chapter 15, it's very specific, and for the sake of time, we won't read it. I wanted to go there, but 1 Chronicles 15, it lays it out. George?
I like what one commentator said. He was carried by the right man in the right way, as Moses had commanded.
And it wasn't a bunch of, big army. It was sacrifices instead. Very different feel, except this is when David is coming along, and Tacho mentioned this, that David was leaping and whirling before the Lord. And this is when Michael looks out. Now, by the way, remind me, what was Michael's? How much time have I got, Grant? Okay, give me 2. Michael, what was her story last couple of chapters? She was forced to come back. Her husband came after her crying. I think that's an awful story, and I just see her as heartbroken as him, being dragged back. And here comes David. She loved David once, but a lot of things have happened. And now she looks out and there's David and she says, look at you, and she comes out to him. Verse 20, how glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself today in the eyes of the maids and his servants, as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. Why was she so upset?
Well, he was king.
He was king, and who wasn't?
What his Lord was dignity.
Yeah. Yeah, so she, did her father ever do anything like that? Actually, her father did something like that once when he was prophesying. But, the point is that, what you're doing is just ridiculous. You're behaving ridiculously. And of course, what he says is, you know what? I'm gonna go like this before the Lord. Kind of this is what I'm gonna do. And then what does it say about their relationship from now on? Yeah, they don't have one. They don't have one. She'll never have any more children, but she does have children because sadly enough, what does the Bible say happens to her children, her sons? They're going to be hung by the Gibeonites. Who's going to give them to the Gibeonites? David. It's interesting. I wish we had a little more time to talk about a little bit more about Uzzah and how important that is, but I think probably most of you understand why that's such a significant story. So we'll wrap it up here. Thanks for great comments, great thoughts tonight. Appreciate the participation. Also online, thank you for that too.